Thanks so much. Maybe we can have the slide off. So let me just start with some questions directed at the first two speakers. I know you talked about, we need to think about some incentives. What could be the incentives for academic researchers to be much more involved in data sharing? And I know you talked about citations or some sort of mechanism like that, or clinicaltrials.gov, putting something in there. But what about tenure committees? What about some real initiatives? What could you imagine that could help, just like publications help, right? That if they share their data and they stimulate more publications, what could the possibilities be in the future to help enable more data sharing?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that in a definitive fashion other than to say these are tricky. I should say my own view is tenure and promotions committees are overdone in terms of their importance in academia. It's easy to say once you've got it and it's passed and the like, but I really do. I don't think that's the be-all or the end-all. And I think other types of recognition are equally important outside of the system. And I think as the culture of data sharing becomes inculcated, as I expect it will, then people will be recognized, and that will accrue some prestige for individuals. And I don't think just individuals in academia, but also individuals in industry. One of the problems in industry is individuals are not as well recognized individually as they are in academia, so we have to take advantage of that individual recognition in academia. Hence, I thought recognizing, one, in publications and two, on clinicaltrials.gov, that this person or this group is a data sharer, and explaining what that is, and over time that information will accrue. So not sure the elaboration was that much more helpful.
I think this was alluded to earlier about multiple paths and not using publications as the end-all to be-all, but thinking about whether there's a common data repository, or whether this data in a model where all formative data, not just at the end of the collection of the data, but during the data accumulation process, and giving the whoever puts those data out there credit at that moment in time. And that's irrespective of the interpretation of the data that may be changed upon secondary analysis. So we're not equating credit for generating data. We're not equating that at the end with a successful clinical trial or a clinical research project, but rather we're equating success with the sharing of those data initially. The sooner the sharing, the more the credit. We're assuming that they're valid. I mean, we're assuming that people are not just going to put up some loosey-goosey information. I don't think it's that difficult, actually, and I think understanding the importance of that can make it through most merits and promotions, notwithstanding that we may be overemphasizing them and there are other kinds of rewards. I think that's easy to do. I think it's also easy to do if we think about turning the system on its head by the journals, by getting invited to share the data publicly. I just think there are lots of venues. We're just not thinking about those venues, and we have to get out of this mindset of the end-all to be-all is the publication in academic medicine. I think Mike tried to allude to that, and I think thinking about that from that perspective is really what we're going to have to do to move this forward.
Joan, I might comment on these academic pathways. When I was involved in creating them, what we used to do was to try to look for an exemplar, an individual who really epitomized what was best about a particular pathway. And we opened up, for instance, a way to get promoted based on your teaching ability. And I think that it's not fair to say that there isn't recognition of this in academia. I think meta-analyses is actually well established. People who do really good meta-analyses can get to the highest ranks of academia. So I would say that the leaders in that area could set the examples and help guide the rest of the academic enterprise, which doesn't know so much about this. They could kind of fan out and say, look, here's another way that'll get somebody to the top of the promotion ladder.
I'm just going to, I have also been in academic medicine for 20 years, and I think that's sort of trying to fix it around the edges. I just think we have to really think differently about this entire infrastructure, about how we share data. Although I think it certainly could work at your institution and some institutions, I think we have to think bigger than that and differently than that, and not just sort of thinking about ways to give people credit for sharing data at the end. I think we just have to think about sharing data from the beginning and throughout the process.
When you put in, or people in your groups put in NIH grants, do you routinely apply for funding specifically for setting up systems and processes for sharing the data? Is it something the university does? It's something that we should add as a standard section of all NIH grants? You know, what's the funding and time requirement and effort requirement?
Well, the short answer is data sharing is an unfunded mandate. In large part from NIH. I mean, I've been writing data sharing plans now for, how long has it been, 5 years since it's been required, but implementing and supervising and policing those plans is pretty much lacking. And there's bigger fish to fry at NIH than trying to keep an eye on those data sharing plans. But the other piece is that it really is rarely considered in a budget. It's pretty much not considered. As I mentioned yesterday, and I have a slide on kind of the 4 categories of data, of costs of data sharing, that I think if one put in 15% of a grant for data sharing costs, it'd be pretty much laughed at, although I think those are actually the real cost and much more justifiable than some of the other costs put in there. So I think there's a way to go. I think also so half the work we do is government-supported, NIH and the like, but there's also industry-supported things, and that has to be worked out also with the sponsor, the data sharing costs going forward prospectively too. And so I think as the culture develops on data sharing, we're able to really introduce this. The final thing on the costs is it needs to be done prospectively. You can't go back at the end of the study and say, nah, you know, whatever the $2 million cost, Michael, that you mentioned, I'm sure are real. It might be a little bit less if it were done prospectively in the beginning and there was some economy of scale as part of it.
Maybe I can just comment that we in industry are in the same movie as Ira. It's an unfunded expense for us too.
So I'm going to think about this unfunded thing because I think we have to get to a place where data sharing, with all the caveats of how you define the data, that is as fundamental to doing research as designing with the appropriate statistical analysis, so that this doesn't become an other, which kind of it is right now. It's sort of instant dependent. So I think this model has to look like that it's an inherent part of it. It's not, it's like evaluation, it's like biostatistics, it's like thinking about the number of patients that would be needed. It's not doing a power analysis. This is part of what we do. So I think we have to get beyond, you know, it is an unfunded mandate, there's no question about it. And depending on the audience I'm at, one audience says this has to be part of the indirects. They're adamant. The other audience, this is for NIH dollars, the other one says it has to be part of the directs, so we're adamant. So that's a conversation stopper. This has to be a fundamental part of how we think about doing research.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll open it up. Do we have time? Is that okay? Okay. So I wanted to talk about investigators and their participation in clinical trials. And for all of you, do you see it, you know, if we only have, let's say, a year before we open up the data, you know, you publish your primary data set, you know, and talk to your journal, your primary endpoints, and then you have a year, let's say, until the data are shared with everyone else. A year is a short period of time if you have a large study or a major outcome study or something. And I'm just wondering if that's going to be a disincentive to, you know, really important investigators or top investigators in the field to participate in trials, knowing that now, you know, there's only going to be one publication. They're doing 100 different things at the same time, and they may not be able to get their act together while everyone else is going to have access to the data. So what do you think about disincentives?
Well, let me just talk about the time frame that one has in our study group, in the Huntington Study Group. We actually impose this on ourselves. If we do a clinical trial, we have to have the data submitted for publication within 12 months of locking the database. That's how we, and this caused a lot of concern, as you can imagine, but it actually accelerates the time of data analysis. It focuses the mind and it gets things done. I think we've been pretty much successful on that. It may be too tight, and I'm not sure all data, then that was a question came up, does all data from the trial have to be shared a year? No, but at least the data that is part of that primary publication, we're still in the traditional publication mode, needs to be available and sharing. And by the way, our sharing has primarily been with the disease communities that we serve in terms of these study groups because they have a particularly vested interest in it. And just one other comment about that, and this relates to consent. I've had an opportunity to consent hundreds of research participants in clinical trials. And on one clinical trial, when you got up to the point of saying this, and that part of the consent, this may not benefit you, but it may benefit others, you know, and he turned to me, he says, how could it benefit others? And I said, well, you know, we're going to publish the data and share. He says, how do I know you're going to publish the data and share the data? And he says, could I stipulate that on the consent? Now, I'd never heard this before. So for all the lawyers here, I called the counsel and I said, you know, what do I do? They want to actually write this in as a stipulation. He says, don't worry about it. It's not a contract. You know, it can't be changed. I got the word, it's kind of like a disclaimer, you know. But it all of a sudden raised my consciousness to the point that our patients and research participants have a great deal invested in the sharing of data. And that particular part of the consent that says, if it's not going to help me, it might help somebody else. So it's just to close that out.
Study get published?
Pardon?
Did that study get published?
What study?
The one the guy said he wouldn't
The
sign
consent.
Oh, that study got, but no, that was a discussion that we had, and he was, you know, the one, I'd never heard somebody who wanted to stipulate something in a clinical trial, maybe others have, so that
Made
was.
sure that study got published.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was on your mind.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I don't know what the number is. Is it 12 months or 2 years? I do think it's reasonable, given the investment that academic researchers make, to give them some protected time. The only area where I think we need to remember that all of this really is about the patient is safety. And that was part of my example. I think when there's a safety issue, we really need to find a way around some of these rules, because that's not about a reanalysis of data. It's really about people who might be in a clinical trial right now or people on a drug right now. So I don't have the exact recommendation for you, but I would bookmark that to revisit.
In other words, if you have a safety issue, you want to check with someone else who has data that might be helpful. That's what you're thinking about.
Through a switchboard, through a regulatory agency. We do it now through the regulators. We say, have you seen this with the one that went before us, or something like that? And they often can't tell us. So it's not a satisfactory system. Well, if it's very serious, I think they find. But so anyway, I would just bookmark that domain.
Artie?
Joe, I just wanted to note that we're actually running out of time, so I'm going to ask the 4 questioners to be concise and our panelists to be concise and try and get these issues discussed.
Artie, then Steve.
So I was a little surprised, Michael, you said that 20% of clinical trials are NIH funded, which is higher than I thought. And so I'm kind of wondering why some of the lessons from the large-scale human, or not just human, genome sequencing projects where you had a team that was committed ex ante to publication, you know, originally with the Human Genome Project within 24 hours. I mean, that may have been absurd, but it was. So why hasn't that model transferred over to some of the other NIH institutes that fund these clinical trials? I have spent a huge amount of time in the human genome community, and so that was a model that worked very effectively, and it was not an unfunded mandate.
Yeah, I don't pretend to understand why that there was a crisis with GWAS studies, as you know, which because they really didn't hold up the way they were originally done, and so they really had to reinvent themselves. So I think they were standing on a burning platform, and that led to a big change in that field. I'm not sure any of us have experienced that in quite the same way in other domains like randomized clinical trials, but I'm sure that that's just a partial view of what actually happened.
There's one obvious little tricky thing about clinical trials compared to observational studies or large bioinformatics studies, and that's the checker. So there's a whole industry of checkers in clinical trials, contract research organizations, insurance that sponsors buy in order to do this. So posting things in real time, as appealing as it might not be as practical as in the types of studies that you referred to.
I don't know who was next, Tim or Steve. So up to Steve.
Mine quick. In terms of incentives, I'm very puzzled by the statement that if we added costs in for data sharing, it would be laughed at, or that it should be part of indirects. We don't make the biostatisticians part of indirects. We don't make the sample size calculation part of indirects. I mean, it's not indirects, and there are lots of things that we recognize have to be paid for. Why, aside from just a recognition that this is part of research, why couldn't the NIH simply require both use in their evaluation of grant proposals whether that investigator, A, published the prior research, we know a lot of it has not been published, and B, prepared it for sharing, and that would be part of the scorecard going forward. I think we'd see a dramatic change almost overnight.
Actually, in my written comments, I actually made that. I agree with that. I think that's exactly the right suggestion. So I can't speak for NIH, but I do think that that's why it's inherently part of doing the research and should be part of that.
I don't think it's budgeted in NIH. I mean, of the $40 billion that NIH spends on research and the $10 billion on clinical trials, increasing that by 15% has not been, I think, really considered to date. There's a lot of talk about data sharing, but the budgeting and the review has really not been part of the process, certainly in my experience.
Well, that's why this whole enterprise has to take a different direction so that it becomes just an inherent part of the process.
So my question is for Michael. In your raising of concerns or sort of potential solutions, you identified pre-specified methods, qualified researchers, and as potential approaches in managing this. I want to raise a question about giving access to patients and citizen scientists who want to participate in this, because the model you've outlined would say to somebody who's a participant is you're not a qualified researcher because you're not an academic investigator, so therefore you don't have access to the data you contributed. And we're seeing that as a growing trend. So how do you address that in your model, and be interested in your response?
No, it's a really good question, and I'm not troubled by the need to qualify a researcher. The NIH does this every day. They don't give grants away to people unless they feel those people are qualified to do that work. There may well be some patients who a independent review panel would look at and say that patient would be qualified to do that work. If not, I think there are other arrangements. They can be partners in the work. They can be participants in a consortium. So I think there are other possibilities.
I got to respond. I'm not sure that would go far enough for many of the patient communities these days, because I see that they would think that that's really an arbitrary distinction, but I think that's something we'd have to consider.
Yeah, well, I think in that case, I like this idea of parity, so maybe we and the NIH would all kind of move in the same direction.
Thank you all so much. And do we have a break now?
Yeah,
Or?
we have a break, which I think is well deserved. We've all been thinking hard. Let's come back at 3:30, please.